Advisor, senior editor of clearancejobs.com. Thank you so much, Sebastian Junger, for joining us to talk about freedom. It was our June book club pick at Clearance Jobs. We sent it out to a number of folks within our community who read it and took advantage of it. I read it probably immediately after I got it, and it was just a great, really interesting, thought-provoking, although that can be a little cliche read. And certainly timely. I don't know what the right word for it is, a book about freedom coming on the heels of a global pandemic where many of us felt not super free for a long time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the timing. Has that kind of been a part of the conversation that you've had or discussed around, it's always an interesting term in America, but it's especially a term that's loaded with a lot of context right now.
Right. Well, yeah, I started writing the book, and I wrote it during the pandemic, but I wasn't particularly thinking about the pandemic, but it did raise some issues. Basically for most societies, and the idea of freedom goes back tens of thousands of years. This isn't a modern idea, right? I think for most societies, you're basically free up until the point where your actions jeopardize other people's lives. And so when you start doing that, so the society said, no, you owe something to your group. You can't do that. You cannot just run red lights. Like, you keep running red lights, you're going to hit somebody and kill somebody. You're not free to do that, right? And so where the government starts to be heavy-handed is in the eyes of the beholder. And some people think that the regulations involving masking and social distancing was a legitimate use of the government mandate to keep everyone safe. And other people felt otherwise. And I'm not going to weigh in on that, but that does seem to be where the question was. Like, what does the government have the right to do in order to protect our lives?
Yeah, and I think there was a line. Let me see if I can find it in my tabs. People love to believe they're free, though, which is hard to achieve in a society that has outsourced virtually all of the tasks needed for survival. I highlighted that. I thought that was interesting. And that also kind of pointed back to some of the themes that you had in Tribe when you wrote about that. So do you think people think they're more free than they are, maybe? Or is that or do you think people understand? Because that was also something too. So this book and Last Patrol kind of go hand in hand. So if you've read the book, now you have to watch Last Patrol, or if you've watched Last Patrol, now you have to read the book. But I think that's interesting because people, when you were asking people then what they thought was one of the great aspects of America or what it means to be American freedom came up again and again. But do you think they know what they mean when they say that? I don't know.
Well, freedom is a very powerful word, and people use it because it seems to cut to the core of our human experience. And when you say I'm doing something, I'm fighting for my freedom, there's this idea. It's like saying I'm defending my children. There's idea like, oh, whoa, okay, like that's a core human value that we're not going to infringe on that, right? And so the problem, though, is that it can be really misused. And I think people use the word freedom to justify doing all kinds of things that are illegal or immoral or what have you. I remember in El Salvador, the group, the insurgency that was trying to overthrow a left-wing government down there, called themselves freedom fighters, or Ronald Reagan called them freedom fighters. And that, it's like, as soon as you call someone a freedom fighter, how can you possibly be against them, right? Well, there were a lot of reasons to be against those guys, but so the word can be misused pretty badly.
Yeah. And then, kind of talk about, so the book is based on basically this kind of 400-mile trek that you made with 3 other guys over the course of, I think about a year, more or less, at different times. And you took railroad routes and paths. So talk a little bit, I loved what you mentioned there, I think, Ian, about, being on the railroad is a unique perspective already because it cross sections all these different aspects of society. So you go through rural America, you go through cities, you go through suburbs, the railroads hit all these aspects. You also had that element of not necessarily being where you should be all the time. So yeah, why make this trek, and why kind of, using the prompting point of taking that specific walk?
Yeah. So it was 8 or 9 years ago, I walked, as you say, 400 miles along the railroad lines from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. and then we turned west and headed for Pittsburgh. The railroad lines are these sort of swaths of no man's land. And you can really do sort of whatever you want out there. There's no cops out there unless they're actively looking for you. A couple of times they were with us, and we managed to evade them. But, you know, we were sleeping under bridges and in abandoned buildings and cooking over fires and getting our drinking water out of creeks. And sometimes we were walking through suburbs or ghettos, or wilderness or farms, or what. It was sort of everything, and it was everything from the inside out. And so it was an environment that I really liked, and we felt, you know, it's illegal to do that. So we called it high-speed vagrancy, because we were carrying everything we needed. We were moving 10, 15 miles a day. But it's illegal. It's private property. It's owned by the freight lines. And so you have to sort of stay out of sight. And I had this sort of insight. I'm like, all right, we're sort of on the margins of society. We're definitely autonomous from society, right? Like every night we were the only people that knew where we were. We were making all our own decisions. But we were, you know, we walked through town to get more food. You know, when we needed more food, we'd walk through a town, buy food, and keep going. And I realized that, yes, we were sort of autonomous in an immediate sense, but basically all the gear we had, the food we were eating, it all came from society. And then that's true for everybody, right? And so you, just to sort of go back to your previous question that I didn't really answer, it's a complicated thing to think that you're free when without the society that you're in, you would be dead within days or maybe weeks. And so you're really not, how free can you be when you're completely physically dependent for your survival on this group? And I realized that when I was out there on the railroad lines, because it felt very, very free. But it just sort of dawned on me. I was like, oh my God, everything we're depending on out here comes from society. So the obvious question is, if that's true, what do you owe society? Right? I mean, every society in the world needs its individuals to contribute to keep the group safe and whole. So in a modern society that's mechanized everything, or a lot of things, what do we as individuals owe our society? And that's, you know, that's where the arguments come in between left and right wing, and maskers and anti-maskers, vaxxers, anti-vax, you know, whatever, a million gun rights, you know, whatever. Like, that's where the argument comes in: is what do we owe our society? And how do we reconcile being completely dependent on it and thinking that we're free?
Yeah. And you mentioned all this. I feel like there continue to be more polarities and more different subsets you can be between. It's like, what if you're a cross section of a lot of these different things? You know, I feel like we need a little more room for crossover and a little less universality. You can't adhere to all of the subsets of each of those. I hope. Maybe you can. I'm incapable of it. So talk to me a little about the people that you kind of walked with, because you didn't do it alone, and I assume there was a thought process there. You certainly could have. And also kind of ties it, do you think there's a movement kind of looking for what you kind of write about here, whether it's freedom or something else? Because even, you know, we've written about traffic on the Appalachian Trail is an all-time high. They say you can't actually get away from people on the Appalachian Trail anymore because it's so crowded. So there seems to be a lot of people that kind of want to take a different path, or that are kind of pursuing, you know, maybe they're not walking the railroad lines, but you did encounter some people out there. There are people that are kind of trying to get a little bit off the grid. So talk to me about, like, what do you think is causing people to want to do this? And even like what caused the people that you walked with to kind of join alongside you, say, hey, we're not going to do this alone. We're going to do this together.
Yeah. So I went out there with a couple of combat vets that I knew from Afghanistan, and a conflict photographer, war photographer named Guillermo Cervera from Spain, who I met because he was with my best friend, Tim, when Tim died in Libya from shrapnel wounds in the city of Misrata. And he was holding his hand as Tim bled out. And so I got to know Guillermo very well. We're the brotherhood from Tim sort of transferred to Guillermo. And so the four of us set out along the railroad lines to sort of encounter America in this sort of like rough, raw way. And we did it over the course of a year. It wasn't one long trip. And the other people that were out there, I mean, there weren't a lot of them, but they were marginal people, right? I mean, they were sort of drifters and homeless, and, you know, like, I mean, the Appalachian Trail, you know, that's a certain part of society, basically, you know, and those aren't generally not marginal people. The railroad lines, it is, and so, and we met a couple of guys that wanted to come with us, and I don't know what they were about, but they just saw, I was like, what is it about four guys walking along railroad lines in the middle of winter, four guys you don't know, that makes you want to join them? Like, what is that about our enterprise that was so appealing to this guy that we met in the middle of the winter in Pennsylvania. And I'm guessing, I didn't ask him, I'm guessing, I don't know what his home situation was, but I'm guessing there was something about the autonomy that we, at least for him, represented that he really was craving. And maybe he had a marriage he didn't like, or a job he didn't like, or God knows what, and we were there walking along free as can be, and it was 15 degrees, but he wanted to join us. It was very touching.
You had perhaps the perfect blend of autonomy and community for that small sliver of time. And I think that even came up, a little bit in the conversations of that, that there is something that's missing even for service members when they kind of re-enter back in. Like, you have this built-in community that the military just really creates for you in some ways. And then you come back home and again, you've written about it before in other contexts, but then you come back home and you're having to recreate that. So I think it is like a tough, it's a tough reentry. And so talk a little about like the movement aspect of it, because that's another thing that I highlighted too. Like, was the movement some aspect of the freedom there that you were kind of, your boots were walking, you were seeing different things and moving along? Did that kind of prompt, and even that's the first chapter, Run. So it's Run, Fight, Think. So maybe talk about Run and freedom in the context of that. And again, this is Lindy Kaiser talking about freedom. If you have questions for Sebastian, you can throw them into the chat. But talk to me a little bit about the Run aspect of freedom.
Yeah. So the book is divided into three sections. It's the three ways that people have typically maintained their autonomy, their freedom in the face of a greater power, for the last tens of thousands of years. The three sections are Run, Fight, and Think. And basically the first instinct by a sort of underdog group is, when threatened, is to run away. The Apaches did that amazingly well. In the American Southwest, the Pueblo societies were sort of stuck on these mesas. They're much more wealthy. They had fields, irrigation, agriculture, and the Spaniards rolled them up immediately. The Apache were poor, materially poor, very mobile, and they remained free, some of them, almost until 1900. Pretty extraordinary. But if you can't outrun your oppressor, you're going to have to outfight him. And interestingly, for humans, as far as I can tell, the only species, the only mammal where a smaller individual or a smaller group can outfight a larger one. And you see that in everything from boxing and the MMA, mixed martial arts, all the way on to, insurgencies and, sort of small wars around the world. The Montenegrins, for example, in the early 1600s, they defeated the Ottoman Empire multiple times. At one point outnumbered 12-1, and this sort of fierce mountain people that were highly mobile and fought really well were able to stop the prime military power in the world then. And then fast forward to Afghanistan. First the Brits, then the Russians, then the Americans, could not defeat the Afghan rebels. In this case, most recently for us, named the Taliban. And what I say in the book is that, I loathe the Taliban, right? They're an awful oppressive group, but if small groups if they could not defeat the empires, right? If they could not defeat larger groups, the world would be run by these sort of fascist megastates, and like the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, and America wouldn't exist. We would not have been able to defeat the Brits 200 some years ago. And finally, if you can't outfight them, you're going to have to outthink them. And there I talk about the labor movement 100 years ago in America, and how internal opposition groups are able to actually mount a very successful defense within the society against the government or what the corporate interests or what have you.
Yeah, Eric says he loves your writing. He hasn't read Freedom. You should read it. I describe it as I never know. It's like you just mentioned probably, 4 or 5 of the anecdotes from the book, but I love it because for every section that you read, it is literally just jam packed with kind of anecdotes and information and context around kind of a bigger thought. And it ties into one of the things I think as a journalist that you've talked about, and I've heard you say a lot of times, you don't tell people what to think, you tell them what to think about. So I feel like this book gives a million different prompts about what to think about. It's a great dinner party book. You're going to need to read it, and then you'll impress all your friends because you'll be able to talk about the Apaches and the railroads and a million other different topics. But maybe speak to that, because how much It's a delightfully short book, which I feel like is good for these times. If you were writing a 400-page book on freedom, I might think twice. But obviously, I know that it's harder to write short than long. I can say that someone who writes. So how do you decide kind of what's important under the big, it's a weighty term like freedom. What did you decide? How did you decide what to include and what got cut or what couldn't make the cut?
Yeah, so some of my books, like The Perfect Storm or War or A Death in Belmont, are about an event, right, or a deployment or what have you. And those need to be really thoroughly documented, and that takes some hundreds of pages, right? My book Tribe and this book Freedom, they're concepts, right? That's an idea. It's a way of thinking about the world. And so I could have written an 800-page book that just kept adding more and more examples of what I'm talking about. But really, why would one do that? Why would I do that? Right? I want to communicate. Give a man a fish he eats once. Teach him to fish he eats the rest of his life. Like I don't need to feed my readers example after example of this way of seeing the idea of freedom. I just need to say it once, and if I do it right, I will communicate the tools, the sort of like way of thinking that then allows other people to take that and see the idea of freedom through their own efforts, their own thoughts, having read my book. And to me, so when you have a concept book, the briefer the better, right? The more efficient you are, the more focused you are, the quicker you get in and say what you have to say and get out, the more people are going to retain, the more people that will read it. So that was why I kept Freedom so short. And, honestly, I didn't even cut anything. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And I mean, I would cut a paragraph once in a while, but whatever, I didn't cut anything major.
Awesome. Yeah, I know. I think that's interesting too. Like if you're talking about an event, you have to provide the context, or you don't have to, but it's more helpful. Where here it is almost like a literary prompt to get people asking the right questions or thinking more broadly about the topic. What I love about this and also about Tribe is that I feel like it's a book that obviously you have a ton of fans within the military space, which makes sense for us here at Clearance Jobs. We have a pretty large military demographic, but we're not all military. Not everybody that has a security clearance is prior service, and that's important because we need diverse perspectives. So same with Freedom. You obviously you're on this track with some combat vets or folks who have seen combat, but it's a book that reads not necessarily specific to the military community. Can you maybe and you've talked about bridging that gap too, that we have this whole concept of the civil military divide, but we have a lot of those divides in society. It's not just service members and whatever, it's the average American and the supply chain. We're all kind of, can be disconnected. So talk about writing this book that clearly has military influence or, kind of context, but it's not something that's specific to a military audience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, even Tribe, there was one section on PTSD and on veterans, combat veterans, but most of the book was really about the lack of social cohesion in this society and what its effects are on people. And for example, the wealthier the society, the higher the rates of depression and suicide. Because in wealthy societies, individuals don't need each other in order to survive every day. In very poor societies, they do, and there's stresses that come with poverty. But that communality of quote village life buffers people from depression and from suicide. So we're very lucky to live in this affluent society. I mean, the benefits are almost endless, but there are costs as well. And we have a society that has very high rates of mental illness and unhappiness and anxiety and drug addiction and all kinds of addiction. And, it's like, damn, we're so affluent. Like, what's wrong? What is going wrong here? Because the outcomes are poor, frankly, And so with Freedom, it doesn't have anything to do with American combat vets or with, war at all, really, other than fighting an enemy has often been the last-ditch effort that many societies have had to resort to maintain their freedom, because humans can be really predatory, and if you can't defend yourself, either from the school bully or from a predatory warlike group, if you can't defend yourself, you're going to be under their power, under their control. You're going to have to do what they say and live the way they want you to live. And there was a group I wrote about called the Yamnaya 5,000 years ago. They were a very warlike group from the Eastern Steppe, and they fought on horse-drawn chariots back when horses were sort of a novelty. They fought with battle axes on horse-drawn chariots. They traveled in all male groups. They were sort of like the first motorcycle gang, basically. And they went right through Europe, and they invaded the Iberian Peninsula 5,000 years ago. And within about 100 years, they killed all of the men in Iberia, all of them, and clearly mated with the women, right? And so radical loss of freedom in the Iberian Peninsula 5,000 years ago because they couldn't defend themselves. And so the trick is, the trick is being well organized enough and militaristic enough and have enough of a hierarchy that you can defend yourself against an outsider like the Yamnaya or Al-Qaeda, right? But without turning that military apparatus on your own people. What dictators do, of course, is they take their awesome military and secret police and intelligence services and all that stuff. And of course, they defend the country if they need to with those things, but mostly they oppress their own people and control their own society. So the trick is, how do you protect your society and have it be an egalitarian, a fair and egalitarian society where where no one has extra rights? You know, the kings and queens of Europe in the Middle Ages could do whatever they want. They could kill people, rape people, plunder. The citizenry had no recourse, right? That's not a free society.
Yeah. Well, you kind of talk about that, the construct of how, you know, protection takes place in societies, and even how it's shifted, how it used to be, you know, you had the leader, the king was going out to battle with the troops. And eventually they were like, well, that's not a very effective. We don't need our king out here, you know, at the front lines of battle. Maybe we're going to put him in the rear somewhere. But it's just kind of, we've had this shift in terms of what it looks like to form a military, you know, to protect, and how that skews different across societies. I feel like I have to talk to you, and you mentioned Al-Qaeda, so you cue to it a little bit. What are your thoughts on the drawdown in Afghanistan? I know you've already kind of come out and you've had some commentary, or folks have asked you, so I'm going to ask you too. So do you have strong thoughts on Afghanistan as someone who's spent so much time over there? Is it tough to think about U.S. troops not being over there?
Yeah, I mean, I started going to Afghanistan in 1996, right when the Taliban were taking over. And I remember someone telling me, you know, we hate them, but we're going to let them in because we're tired of the corruption in this country. You know, there was a civil war. It was very corrupt. And so we're going to let them in. There's a high correlation between corruption and sort of radical Islamic insurgencies that, like ISIS or Boko Haram or the Taliban. And the Shabab in Somalia. So those Islamic, like very, very hardcore Islamic leadership it's a cure for corruption, and people hate corruption, right? So what happened when the U.S. went in? We went in with a light footprint. It was an easy fight against the Taliban. They folded almost immediately, and then we basically left, right? I mean, we went on to Iraq, and we tried to keep Afghanistan quiet by pumping billions and billions of dollars into that company, basically trying to pay off the warlords to not fight us, right? But that was corruption on steroids. So we were doing exactly the thing that the Afghans didn't want to have happen. It was a disastrous policy, right? And so then we sort of got it flattened down again because, you know, we put in 100,000+ soldiers, you know, under Barack Obama, and that rocked the Taliban back on their heels. But really, you know, they have a rear base in Pakistan. We're not going to wipe them out. And now we're drawing down to zero. And, you know, 2,500 troops seem to be enough to keep the whole government from falling, which, of course, would be a good thing. There's 40,000 cops in New York City, just to give you a sense of the scale of what 2,500 soldiers is. And so I feel like the win is largely symbolic, right? I mean, it's a very small number of U.S. forces. The casualties, thank God, in last years in Afghanistan have been pretty minimal, you know, and we were able to keep that country from falling once again to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And so now what's going to happen? That it might fall again to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and then we don't know where it will go. So you could read between the lines here. I don't tell people what to think, but I do tell them what I think the cost of something will be. And I think the cost for Afghanistan is, pretty horrific for the Afghan people and maybe even dangerous for us.
Yeah, I think sometimes our historical precedence on it seems we're looking at a sliver versus, again, like looking back to that context of what's been happening in Afghanistan over the past 2 to 3 decades, not just the past, 10 years or even post 9/11. There's context before that. Yeah. So Eric has a question, and I know we'll have to wrap up. I think it's a good one. He asks about, you seem to have gained different perspective as a war correspondent. He answered it for you. I'm going to let you answer it. Do you think it shaped who you are as a person, all the time that you spent overseas as a war correspondent? And do you think there's anything that you gained from the experience that maybe you haven't already shared or that folks might not know about?
I mean, hopefully everything shapes you as a person. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to think of something that might not have shaped me, something significant, and there isn't anything. But yeah, being a war reporter, certainly. I mean, it requires a certain kind of person to want to do that, and then, like joining the military or joining a combat unit. But then once you do that, you're going to be enormously affected. Combat is violent and it's upsetting, and it can be in some ways also a little bit addictive. I mean, it's a lot of things. And, I was very traumatized by things that I saw. I don't necessarily mean with the U.S. military, but I covered a lot of wars before that. And, I had I came home with some real issues. I didn't know what they were because this was before 9/11. So no one was talking about PTSD. And then when I started to sort of hear the conversation around PTSD in terms of American soldiers, I was like, oh my God, of course. I had panic attacks in the New York City subways after I came back from Afghanistan in 2000. Of course, so classic symptoms. I had no idea. So yeah, it definitely shaped me. And I would say vastly for the better.
Mm-hmm. And then Kate, last question from Katie. Katie asks, what's your next project? You're done with Freedom. You just keeping the Freedom book tour going, or are you already thinking of your next book or film?
Yeah, I'm. So I just, I have two young girls, a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. I'm definitely not doing any more war reporting. I don't even like to travel that much anymore because of them. I want to be with them, But last year I had a very rare thing happen. I had an aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, super rare, undiagnosed, asymptomatic, and it ruptured without warning. And I not only did I almost die, I should have died. Like almost no one survives what I had. And I lost 90% of my blood, 90, and they were able to bring me back. And I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. I'm not mystic in any way. But as I was, I was actively dying, right? I mean, I was getting pulled down a dark hole that was underneath me in the last minutes. And before they got me back just in time. But my dead father appeared and started comforting me. And I am at a loss to explain what he was doing there. I didn't know I was dying, And so I want to write a book about that. I want to write a book called Pulse about what keeps us alive and what happens when we die. A non-religious, non-mystical book. My dad was a physicist. I want to write a book that he would respect, but trying to explain what the hell he was doing there. Like, Dad, of you of all people, like you didn't believe in anything, and here you are. It was amazing.
Well, it sounds like a book that's going to be worth reading. Freedom was definitely a book worth reading. So we hope all the folks who joined us today will pick up a copy and read it. Again, definitely a worthwhile read, a lot to learn and a lot of good questions. I feel like this is the time we need to be asking good questions and engaging in good questions and dialogue. That's what I love to see. It's like there's a lot of different perspectives, and we can, if we can gather around great content, that's always a good thing. So thank you so much, Sebastian. I really appreciate what you do, the work that you've done, and the work that you continue to do. We can't wait to read Pulse. Eric's excited to read it too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the conversation.